In less than 1 hour, two women were brutally murdered, not in different parts of the city nor on different nights, but within 45 minutes and on the same streets. At the time, no one believed the killings were connected. Two different police forces wrote reports without yet realizing they were describing the same man.
Scientists say Jack the Ripper's real name may have been Aaron Kosminski. That's according to genetic test results published last week.
The first discovery. The first body was found around 1 a.m. on September 30th, 1888. Louis Diemschitz turned his pony-drawn cart onto Dutfield's Yard, a narrow passage off Berner Street in the East End of London. Diemschitz was the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, and he was returning from a trip to collect goods for the building. As the cart rolled into the dark yard, the pony suddenly shied to the left. Diemschitz felt the wheels jolt. Assuming the animal had stumbled over debris, he climbed down to investigate. He struck a match. What the light revealed was the body of a woman lying on her left side, just inside the yard's gateway. Her feet pointed toward the street. Her dress was pulled up slightly, but she was otherwise fully clothed. There was not any sign of struggle in the yard, no trail of blood. Diemschitz initially believed that the woman was drunk or unconscious. He touched her face, it was still warm. When he noticed blood pooled beneath her neck, he ran into the club to raise the alarm. Police were summoned immediately. When officers arrived, they observed a single deep incision across the woman's throat, extending from left to right. The cut had severed the carotid artery, and there were no other visible wounds. Dr. Frederick Blackwell later noted that the cut was clean and uninterrupted, consistent with a single motion delivered while the victim was upright or being restrained. The victim was later identified as Elizabeth Stride, 44 years old. She had been alive minutes before she was found. That should have been the end of it, but there was more. Before anyone noticed, in the hours before Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's Yard, nothing about the night appeared unusual. Earlier on September 29th, Stride had been seen several times around Whitechapel and St. George in the east. At approximately 7 p.m., she was observed outside a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. Later that evening, she was spotted near Berner Street, speaking with different men as she moved between public houses. These were routine movements for a woman trying to earn enough for a bed. No one followed her for long. The last confirmed sighting came around 12:35 a.m. A man named Israel Schwartz told police he saw a woman matching Stride's description near the entrance to Dutfield's Yard. According to Schwartz, the woman was speaking with a man who suddenly pushed her to the ground. Schwartz crossed the street, uneasy, and continued walking. He later heard what he believed was a shout, but did not intervene. At the time, this meant nothing. Arguments between couples were common. Violence in the street was not rare. A woman falling or being shoved did not trigger alarm, especially in a district where shouting often meant nothing more than drunkenness or domestic disputes. Only later did the timing become disturbing. The location, the proximity to the yard entrance, the fact that Stride was alive minutes before Louis Diemschitz arrived, what looked ordinary in the moment only gained meaning in retrospect. And that meaning would not stay confined to one street for long. Routine in a violent district. You see, Whitechapel was not a quiet place, even by Victorian standards. By 1888, the district was overcrowded, impoverished, and heavily policed. Assaults, robberies, and domestic violence were common enough that few incidents stood out on their own. For residents and officers alike, violence had a baseline. One murder, tragic as it was, did not automatically signal something new. Police patrols followed strict routines. Constables walked fixed beats, checking alleys, courts, and main roads at regular intervals. On Berner Street, officers passed through multiple times each hour. If nothing was seen or heard, they moved on. The absence of witnesses mattered more than the presence of a body discovered later. This logic shaped the response to Stride's death. Screams weren't reported at the moment of attack, hence there was no pursuit. From a procedural standpoint, it looked like a sudden, isolated killing, the kind the East End had seen before. Investigators focused on immediate possibilities: a jealous client, a personal dispute, a local offender who fled quickly. There was no reason yet to widen the scope, and that is because the pattern wasn't clear. The pressure to rethink assumptions was absent. This wasn't so much of incompetence as it was routine, but routine depends on time behaving as expected, on violence remaining scattered rather than being compressed, on one incident staying separate from the next. And somewhere else in Whitechapel, the clock was already working against that belief. 45 minutes later, at approximately 1:45 a.m., less than an hour after Elizabeth Stride was discovered, another body was found. This time it wasn't in Whitechapel proper, it was inside the city of London, in a small, open space known as Mitre Square. The man who found her was Police Constable Edward Watkins, assigned to patrol the square every 15 minutes. When he passed through at 1:30 a.m., nothing was there. The square was empty and quiet. When he returned, just 14 minutes later, a woman lay on her back near the southwest corner. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. She was 46 years old. Her throat had been cut. Unlike the first victim, her injuries did not stop there. Her abdomen had been open. Parts of her face had been mutilated. The violence was immediate, deliberate, and far more extensive. Her left kidney and a section of the uterus had been deliberately removed, indicating that mutilations continued after death and were not incidental to the killing. Eddowes had been alive when Watkins last passed. She was dead when he returned. That meant the murder had taken place between 1:30 and 1:44 a.m. inside a square regularly patrolled by police. Other officers confirmed the overlap. Constable James Harvey had walked through Church Passage, one of the square's entrances, just minutes before the body was found. He saw no one, heard nothing. And now the question was no longer who had done this, it was how someone had moved so quick and clean through the streets already under watch. Burner Street. The distance between the two crime scenes was less than a mile. Elizabeth Stride was killed on Burner Street. Catherine Eddowes died in Mitre Square. Note that on foot, the walk between them takes roughly 10 to 15 minutes depending on the route. The streets connecting them, Commercial Road, Aldgate High Street, Duke Street, were busy even late at night, lit by gas lamps and crossed by constables on fixed beats. And here is why this mattered. It meant the killings weren't scattered across the city. They were compressed into a narrow corridor of movement. A person leaving Dutfield's Yard shortly before 1 o'clock could reach Mitre Square well before 1:30 without running, without drawing attention. Patrol schedules overlapped but did not connect. Jurisdictions changed block to block. The Metropolitan Police covered Burner Street. The City Police controlled Mitre Square. So information did not move as quickly as the killer did. To investigators, this geography complicated the night. The two scenes were no longer separate incidents. They were part of a single window of time, linked by distance and administrative gaps. It was deliberate, and with that realization came something far more dangerous than panic. Whoever had done this was still moving and had already proven how easily the city could be crossed without being stopped. The moment the pattern emerged, it all started to surface inside police stations and hurried conversations between exhausted men who were comparing notes they had never expected to connect. By around 3 a.m. on September 30th, 1888, senior officers from the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police were exchanging timelines. Until then, jurisdiction had kept the murders mentally separate. Obviously, when there are different streets, there's different reports. But once the times were written down side by side, things started becoming clearer. Elizabeth Stride was killed shortly before 1 a.m. Catherine Eddowes was murdered no later than 1:44 a.m., so this roughly 45-minute window changed everything. Clearly, this wasn't a chance recurrence of street violence. It wasn't a domestic dispute gone wrong, or a lone robbery that escalated. The speed alone suggested intent. The movement between scenes suggested confidence. And the escalation of injury suggested something even worse. Internally, alarms were raised before the public knew anything had shifted. Detectives began using language they had avoided for weeks. Patterns, sequence, same hand. There was no press briefing or warning issued to residents, and that is because police leaders understood the danger of panic, especially in Whitechapel. But at the same time, resources were redirected. Patrols were quietly adjusted. Senior investigators were pulled from other cases. For the first time, the possibility was acknowledged someone was hunting. East End. By daylight, the silence just couldn't hold. Newspapers had hit the streets within hours. Headlines spoke of another Whitechapel murder. Some went further, hinting at connections that the police had refused to confirm. Names spread uncontrollably quickly and obviously, and so did the exaggerations. Sadly, way too many rumors outran facts. In lodging houses along Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street, doors started to close earlier than they usually would. Women stayed inside longer after nightfall. Men started to walk in groups instead of alone. Most people now carried makeshift weapons like sticks, tools, or anything that felt like control. So far, the police had issued no curfews, but behavior changed regardless. Streets that were normally alive late into the night were absolutely silent. Public houses emptied sooner. Gas lamps felt dimmer, not because they were, but because it was now easier to notice the dark between them. Official statements remained careful, almost restrained. As of now, there was no confirmation of a single killer, nor acknowledgement of escalation. Authorities feared that naming the threat would give it power. But the East End didn't need confirmation. Fear had its own intelligence. It recognized patterns long before paperwork did. The crime was different from what was commonly seen, and beneath the spreading anxiety, another question began to rise. If two women could be killed within 45 minutes, what was stopping a third? London. By mid-morning on September 30th, 1888, the story had spread across London on cheap paper and bold font. The Star ran with language that blurred fact and implication, describing the killings as another horror in the East End, and openly questioning whether the crimes were connected. By afternoon, even the more restrained Times acknowledged the unusual timing, even though it avoided speculation. But the details didn't travel cleanly. Given the uncertainty, times were rounded and distances were exaggerated. In some accounts, the murders were said to be minutes apart. In others, the killer was described as sprinting across districts unseen. Anonymous witnesses appeared in print offering descriptions police had never confirmed. Accounts of a leather apron, foreign accent, and a medical bag floated around. Each retelling sharpened the story while accuracy faded. By noon, the idea of coincidence had vanished entirely from public conversation. The murders had merged into a single narrative. The name Jack the Ripper had not yet fully solidified, but the outline was there, a figure moving freely through the city that the authorities somewhat struggled to explain in any way for now. And as the papers piled up on street corners, police realized something else was happening alongside the investigation. Control of the story was slipping away. Policing under pressure. An examination of Whitechapel patrol routes revealed that they were designed for deterrence rather than pursuit. Officers on patrol were meant to create visibility, not overlap. On the night of September 29th, several constables passed within minutes of both murder sites, but never at the same time, never close enough to intersect. The lighting also made things worse. Gas lamps were spaced irregularly, leaving long, fairly stretches of shadow between pools of light, Doorways, alleys, and courtyards created dozens of blind spots where someone could disappear in a matter of seconds, meaning a man moving with purpose could time his steps between patrols without ever being seen. At the same time, no suspect was stopped because there was no description for authorities to match. By the time bodies were discovered, the killer was already far gone, absorbed back into the streets, crowded enough to hide him, poor enough that no one stood out. The Metropolitan Police and City Police continued to operate separately, with different command structures and communication gaps. No one knew how much those gaps mattered that night. A system built for ordinary crime was suddenly facing something it wasn't designed or equipped to catch. And now, under public scrutiny and media pressure, every weakness was visible. The city had changed overnight. But the police were still chasing shadows, and they didn't yet know how many more nights they'd have to do it. Why no one was caught? Back then, the reason no one was caught that night comes down to minutes and mere meters. It was a matter of misconnections between the discovery of the first body and the second. The killer had a window of roughly 45 minutes. That span meant the murders didn't trigger an immediate manhunt. Scheduled patrolling showed units were unaware they were already behind the timeline. If someone moved just after a patrol cleared an area, they had near total freedom until the next pass. That night, both crime scenes sat just far enough apart to fall under different patrol rhythms. Communication in that area made it worse. In 1888, there were no radios. Messages moved by foot or whistle in case of emergencies. Once a body was found, the nearest officer had to locate a superior, who then decided whether to alert surrounding beats. By the time word began spreading, the second murder had already occurred. Because of that, descriptions simply failed to travel. Any witness who spoke did so locally to the first officer they encountered. There wasn't a centralized system to compile sightings in real time like we have today. No way to connect fragments before they went cold. What people were calling escape was actually timing. At the time, they just called it brilliance and invisibility. Just a city moving too slowly to catch someone moving fast. Why these two murders mattered. Metropolitan Police summaries from the early 1880s list frequent stabbings tied to alcohol, domestic disputes, and street fights. Most were even resolved quickly. There were always witnesses involved or weapons were recovered. Almost every time, clear motive could usually be inferred. But here, neither victim was robbed. Coins and personal effects remained with the bodies. There was zero evidence of a struggle beyond the wounds themselves. Medical examiners noted focused injuries delivered after the victims were already incapacitated, a departure from typical street violence documented in coroner's files. Internal police memoranda from late August 1888 reflect a change in classification. Investigators finally stopped treating the cases as independent homicides and began comparing wound patterns, time windows, and patrol gaps. Although this was not public yet, it was decisive internally. The shift then never reversed. Within days, the Metropolitan Police implemented measurable changes. The patrol frequency in Whitechapel was increased, with beats strategically shortened to reduce unobserved intervals. Officers were instructed to log precise times at fixed points, which was not consistently enforced before August 1888. Gas lamp inspections were ordered after reports identified poorly lit stretches along regular routes. The press response followed a documented pattern. Papers such as the Star and the East London Advertiser began running daily updates instead of isolated crime reports. Headlines emphasized chronology and proximity rather than motive. This marked a shift from reporting crime to tracking a sequence. Cross-district coordination and press briefings remained expanded long after the initial murders. The one lasting change, however, was administrative. Crime was no longer assessed incident by incident. Patterns became evidence. In the absence of witnesses, noise and mistakes became data. Victorian London did not return to its earlier assumptions and move forward under a new one. But silence itself could be the real warning. By the time officials argued over jurisdiction and procedure, the damage had already been done, and it was irrecoverable.